Most music students study tonal harmony, and they learn rules about voice leading, chord progressions, cadences, and so on. But much music today is not tonal in the classical sense. There's not much teaching material about harmony beyond Wagnerian chromaticism. The best book available about this subject is 20th Century Harmony by Vincent Persichetti. It introduces the student to many techniques with no particular ideological slant. It includes many examples and exercises by Persichetti himself. But all the examples were written specifically for this book, and there is no audio. There are some basic notions common to all styles of harmony which Persichetti doesn't discuss. I call them general principles of harmony. They apply both to tonal music and to non-tonal music. They're discussed in more detail in my free online book. The link is available under the video here. Here are a few examples of these principles in various harmonic styles. But first, remember that harmony doesn't exist in a vacuum. Thinking of harmony only in terms of notes is like thinking of language only as single words with no syntax, tone of voice, context, and so on. Here are 4 chords. Clearly the first 2 chords are very similar, as are the next 2. But if we look at the harmony alone, the first and the third chords are identical, as are the second and fourth chords. Why isn't this obvious? The reason is that register, timbre, rhythm are all much more salient than the details of pitch. Only if we homogenize all these primary aspects of the sound can we focus on the harmonic similarities. Here are the same chords, all in the same timbre and in the same register. The differences are still pretty subtle, but with careful listening we can now hear the similarity between the first and third and the second and the fourth chords. So if you want to use harmony as a unifying element in a piece, it has to be reinforced by timbre and spacing and so on. Don't distract the listener with other salient contrasts. Now let's get to those general principles. The first basic principle is that no matter what the harmonic language, it will need punctuation. Punctuation is a basic musical requirement because human memory can't take in indefinitely long phrases. Harmony has to do its job, creating punctuation. While the details will vary depending on the kind of harmony being used, punctuation is always necessary. Here's a short example for oboe and strings with harmony by seconds and sevenths. The bass is doubled in octaves, pizzicato, below. To keep the overall sound consistent, the ending can't just reduce to a traditional consonance. It would sound completely wrong. So I used the rhythmic stop of the last chord to set it off. The faster rhythm in the accompaniment just before also suggests to the listener that something special is coming along. The melody returns to the opening D, which now makes a consonance with the bass B flat. That also helps create a sense of cadence. And all 3 parts arrive at their final notes by step. The result of all this is a convincing cadence. With harmony by fourths, or polyharmony, the details would be different, but the need for liqueur cadence would be the same. In tonal harmony, the tonic provides an obvious goal. But it's also possible to create harmonic direction without a tonal center. Here's an example. Note that the bass line is again doubled an octave lower by pizzicato double basses. Although there's no tonic here, direction comes from the stepwise rising bass in octaves and also from the crescendo. The top part is also mostly conjunct. Direction is a very powerful tool for adding focus and intensity. Stepwise bass lines, as in tonal harmony, create harmonic direction. But there are other ways to do it. For example, I could gradually increase the amount of dissonance in the phrase up to a climax. Our last example also illustrates another fundamental principle: voice leading. Chords don't exist in a vacuum. The music must arrive at and leave each chord in a coherent way. Apart from occasional isolated single chords, voice leading doesn't disappear because the music isn't tonal or because it isn't constructed out of familiar chords. The phrase voice leading means exactly what it says. Each voice must be led logically to the next note. Already in the early 20th century, composers like Fauré were experimenting with chords which were more the result of voice leading than of root positions. Here's a short bass line in A minor, harmonized in a straightforward tonal style. Now, here are two more versions of the same bass line, but with very different harmonies above. The upper parts are filled out with what I call linear harmony. The voice leading in the upper parts here is always conjunct, and the resulting sonorities all form triads or seventh chords. These are only two of many possible versions. I could do the same thing with, for example, chords by fourths, and another, different harmonic world would open up. But the underlying logic would still come from the smooth voice leading. Music has to breathe. Harmonic density shouldn't always remain the same. By density, I mean how many different pitches are sounding at once, on average, and the degree of dissonance created by their constituent intervals. For example, if most of the chords contain 6 notes or more, and if they are spaced with lots of seconds, the harmony will just sound very dense. When this goes on for any length of time, the result is gray. Generally, the more notes, the less each one counts. The chords become masses of sound without much detail. Here are 2 cluster chords. I've notated them on 2 staves just for legibility, but each one sounds simultaneously. Each chord is missing one semitone, but the difference between them is very hard to hear since there are so many simultaneous dissonances. With 4-note chords, a difference of 1 note is much more easily audible. This does not mean that very dense chords should always be avoided, but they do have tremendous inertia, and subtle differences usually go unnoticed. These chords can be useful as occasional special events, but used continuously they get colorless unless the differences are highlighted by orchestration, unusual spacing, and so on. Another way to vary harmonic density is with ornamentation. The non-harmonic tones of classical harmony greatly lighten the texture between the chords. As long as the normal harmonic sound in a given language is clearly defined, it should be possible to use melodic ornamentation. Here's an example. The passing notes and neighbor notes in the clarinet line here don't detract from the overall quartal sound, but they do make the melody much more interesting than it would be if it were limited to only notes and the accompanying chords. They also lighten the texture. Another very useful harmonic notion, mentioned by Roger Sessions in his book Harmonic Practice, is harmonic accent. To create interesting harmonic terrain, some events need to stand out. Here are those clusters again. If we repeat them a few times, but now follow them with a contrasting chord, spaced out more widely, the latter becomes a sort of an accent, despite being quieter than the clusters. It's the contrast that attracts our attention. Well-chosen contrasts renew interest. If the harmonic language allows for no clear contrasts, it won't be useful for more than very short passages. One final basic principle: harmonic zones. In music which isn't tonal, if the rate of chromatic circulation is always the same, the composer is deprived of a very important kind of variety. In tonal music, we call these harmonic zones keys, and changing zones is modulation. We can achieve similar effects in non-tonal harmony. Here's a mode, and then an example based on it. By saving the B flat and the A flat until the end, the dynamic accent in the last bar is enhanced by the novelty of these new pitches. The octaves strengthen the effect even more. Some atonal composers avoid octaves, but psychoacoustic facts like the special harmonic solidity provided by an octave are valuable resources. One can favor or avoid any interval in a given passage, but that doesn't make all intervals interchangeable. Judicious focus on certain intervals and pitches gives the music much more character than it has when they're all being used all the time. A couple of final points. Tonality evolved over centuries. It's an open system. It doesn't exclude innovations as long as they make audible sense. Invented systems and theories, serialism is the best known example, never allowed for the kind of freedom provided by non-harmonic tones in tonal harmony. Invented harmonic systems, especially quasi-mathematical ones, may seem logically seductive, but their musical application is usually entirely theoretical, since their logic mostly has nothing to do with how people actually hear. If a system of harmony makes no provision for cadence, providing various degrees of tension and density, and so forth, it will be impossible to use in a musically convincing way. On the other hand, many harmonic possibilities, for example polychords or modes, don't need to be 100% rigid in their application. Intelligently used, they create a distinct harmonic sound, but without excessive rigidity. Being able to move smoothly between different kinds of harmony within the same piece is also very useful. We could start off with an invented mode, then smoothly move on to a passage based on a polychord, and then on to harmony by fourths. As long as the transitions are convincing, the result remains completely coherent. This little talk doesn't by any means cover all the harmonic possibilities in post-tonal music. The point is just to suggest some useful ways to think about harmony in any style. Listen carefully and critically to what you write, experiment with harmonic techniques to find exciting ideas, and then use them in musical ways.